Hey guys, Joey here from 9 to 5 Escape. Today we're working on the 2005 Toyota 4Runner, the V8 model of it actually. We're going to be installing the Daystar lift and leveling kit. It's 2.5 inches in the front and 1.5 in the rear. Chris is going to help me out install it. So as Chris would say, let's get into it. So let's open this thing up and see what's inside. Two front spacers, the 3 holes for the shock mount. It's actually double the thickness of the spacers with the lift you get, so I think this would be half of 2.5. The rear spacers are pretty big. They go on top of the spring itself. They actually changed this lift kit. You actually had 6 pieces instead of 4 last time. It's easier now. And then all the parts, you put extensions on the top of the shock mount. They gave you red Loctite, so it's more permanent and stays on there, but I'll probably be replacing this and putting some new suspension components on, so I'm going to do blue Loctite instead. And then some instructions that may or may not be useful. They actually give you a sticker too that has a warning sign on it, saying that the suspension has been modified. I don't know who it's for, what it's for, where to put it, but I'm just going to probably throw it away.
Here's a few tools you're going to need for the job. First one's a torque wrench, a jack stand, a set of pliers or vice grips, a socket set with a ratchet, a hammer, a punch, some brake cleaner to clean things up, a 14mm wrench, 17mm, and 19mm wrench, preferably of the ratcheting variety if you can get it, lift spacer, the extension bolts for the lift spacer, some blue Loctite, some liquid wrench or some PV blaster to get some of the stuck bolts off, a Sharpie or 2, a 4-way lug wrench, some lighting, and finally a jack. Preferably not a low profile jack on a 4Runner that's a little bit lifted, but this is the only one I have for now. First step is to jack up the car, put it on jack stands, take off the front skid plate and remove the tire. Definitely need to jack up the car from the frame. If you jack it up from the suspension system, you'll be fighting against yourself. And I definitely do recommend jacking the car up on both sides. I'll talk about that later and why you should do that. Next, you want to spray and lubricate all of the bolts that you're going to be working on. The tie rod end bolt, the top shock mount bolts, the camber and toe adjustment bolts, and finally the bolts that attach the lower control arm to the knuckle. Next, you want to remove the tie rod end nut. It's a 17mm. This is where I ran into issues of the tie rod being in tension because of having one wheel on the ground and one in the air. It creates too much tension to be able to pull the end out. So this is where I recommend definitely lifting the car from the full front end and getting both tires off the ground. Now you want to loosen the lower shock mount bolt. It's a 17mm bolt. You can try to take the bolts out, but the compression of the spring will probably hold it in place, so we'll take it out later. Now you can move on to the lower control arm bolts. I would recommend cleaning the outside of the adjustment cams so you can draw on it with a Sharpie. You're going to be drawing a line on the cam itself and a line on the frame. That way you can line them up when you put it back together. There's going to be 4 adjustment cams, 2 on each arm of the lower control arm. You're going to want to mark all of those with a Sharpie. Once you get them all marked up, you can loosen the lower control arm bolts. There's going to be 2 of them and they are 19mm. You don't want to take the bolts all the way out, you just want to loosen them so that the lower control arm can swing down and not actually detach. Now you can remove the 2 19mm bolts that hold the lower control arm to the knuckle. Now you want to get your punch and your hammer so we can remove the bolt going through the lower shock mount. Have someone hold the bottom of lower control arm or put a jack under it, because it is going to fall down as soon as you get that lower bolt out. Since I didn't take out the tie rod, and I had actually ended up putting a jack under the rotor to hold up that whole system. Next up is the 14mm top shock mount bolts. These are a pain to get to. With the traditional socket, it doesn't really fit too well, so you have to use a wrench. I do recommend using those ratchet style wrenches to get in there. The third bolt is even harder to get to, and we actually had trouble getting it loosened because there was just no leverage. So we ended up tying a towel to it and having two people yank on it just to get it loose. Once you completely loosen those bolts, the shock assembly itself will actually fall out, so make sure you're holding it when you loosen it. Now we can finally get to putting on the spacer and the stud extenders. Like I said, I recommend using the blue Loctite in case you ever want to take these off. The red Loctite is very permanent. You have to heat it to get it off, so just keep that in mind. So just apply a little bit of that blue Loctite to the threads, thread on the extenders, and then try to tighten them as best as you can, just so they hit the top of the shock mount itself. Now we can start putting it all back together. I'd recommend putting the lift spacer on top of the shock mount after you get the shock assembly through the steering rack and the CVs. Otherwise it's not going to fit. It's a little bit wider than the shock mount itself, so it can get hung up on those things. Now the painful process of putting the top shock mount bolts back on. If you don't have that ratcheting saw wrench, you're going to have a bad time. They are supposed to be torqued to 47 foot-pounds. Can't really get a torque wrench in there, at least in the back one. The front two you might be able to. So just get them as tight as you possibly can. I actually had to tag Chris in for this one because I was getting tired of turning the wrench 1/8 of a turn at a time. So if you've got a buddy to help you out, then good for you. Next up is putting the lower shock mount bolt in. May take an extra hand to swing up the lower control arm and put the bolt into place. This is supposed to be torqued to 100 foot-pounds, so make sure you get that correct. And you may need a wrench on the other side of your torque wrench to hold the bolt and the nut at the same time. Now you can use a jack to lift the lower control arm up into place to put the two bolts in to connect it to the knuckle. These two bolts need to be torqued to 118 foot-pounds. You may take some extra wiggling or lifting to get the bolt holes to line up perfectly with the knuckle. Now we can tighten the alignment adjustment bolts. These bolts need to be torqued to 129 foot-pounds. Before you do torque them down, make sure you align up your lines that you drew with Sharpies. That way your alignment can be pretty close to in spec. Last but not least is the tie rod end. If you did end up taking this out and off, you need to torque the bolt back down to 52 foot-pounds. Now you can put your tire on and move on to the rears. Don't forget to reattach your skid plate. First step, as always, is to remove the tires. Lug nuts are 21mm. You want to remove the rear driver and rear passenger tires. Jack it up from the frame since you're working on the suspension components. Now that the tire's off, you want to remove the stabilizer link on both sides of the car. The top nut is a 12mm, and use a ratchet wrench if you can, while you're holding it with a 14mm on the bottom. Might be a little easier to use a vice grip to hold it into place if you don't have a 14mm. The last thing holding the axle in place is the lower shock mount. You're going to want to remove that bolt with a 17mm socket. It may get stuck on there if you have the axle drop down. The angle between the shock and that shock mount kind of makes it bind in place. If you jack the axle back up, it may slide off a little easier, and give it a little tap with your hand or a rubber mallet. Now that the axle is free to swing down, you can take the spring out. If it doesn't, you can give the axle a push down a little bit with your hands and wiggle the spring out. And the top of the spring is going to be the bump stop. You're going to want to save that because the spacer is going to be installed with the bump stop and the spring. For this job, I'm installing the FJ Cruiser springs in the rears that actually give it a little bit more lift. So they're pretty similar to the 4Runner, about the same height. So I'm not sure how much lift they're going to give me. Some people have reported a quarter to half an inch higher in the rears than the 4Runner springs would give. The bump stop goes inside the spacer, and the spacer goes on top of the spring. And then you're going to reinstall the spring, bump stop, and spacer back onto the spring seat where it was before. You might need to use the bottle jack that comes with the car to pry the axle away from the frame. You can stick the bottle jack on the axle and against the bump stop above it to press it away from each other. Since you're adding an extra 1.5 inches, it's going to be harder to get the spring in. Make sure the bottom of your spring is seated against the mount correctly. There's a little notch in the bottom spring mount that the spring needs to turn and hit against the stop. Now you can let the jack back up and let the spring go into place. Make sure it's seated correctly in the top as well as the bottom. Be sure to install the other side before you go reassembling any of the suspension components. You want the axle to be free to move, that way you can install the extra spacer. After you've installed both sides, you can begin assembling the components. Start with the bottom shock mount bolt. This was the 17mm bolt, and you're going to torque it down to 72 foot-pounds. Again, you may have to jack up the axle to get the shock to line up with that mount. Now you want to install the stabilizer links. Put in one side and just loosely put the nuts on. Then you want to go back to the other side and install that one as well. Once you get one side all tightened up, you're not going to be able to fit the other one back into place. You're going to want to torque that down to 18 foot-pounds, or as much as possible with using a wrench. Now put your tires back on, take the jack stands out, and torque your lug nuts to 82 foot-pounds.
Alright guys, got the lift installed. 1.5 in the rears. It's a little higher in the rear, so it's not quite leveled, but I did end up putting the FJ springs in, so that probably made it a little higher in the back. If you haven't noticed, the wheels and tires are new, so that may have thrown off the leveling a bit. So I wouldn't put the Daystar leveling kit out of the equation for being level. Everything's torqued to spec. They recommended to check everything in 500 miles to make sure it's all back into spec, because things can get loose if you didn't tighten it. Most of the suspension components on here are stock, so I doubt it's ever been touched. Everything was pretty tough to break loose. So since it is lifted, I would recommend adjusting your headlights to be a little lower. You're going to be beaming people right in the back of the rear view mirror. I was driving around earlier and the lights were just hitting like stop signs and street signs and stuff, so I'm sure I was pissing people off. Hope you guys found this video helpful. If it was, hit that like button. If you want to see future videos of this 4th Gen 4Runner or Chris's 5th Gen 4Runner or some of our trips and travel videos, hit the subscribe button. Any other questions or things we didn't cover, leave a comment down below. We'll definitely reply to it. So be sure to check out our other social media outlets, Facebook, Instagram, we're on there, 9to5escape, or check out our website, 9to5escape.org. We've got links to all our social media places down below in the description, so check those out. And that's all. See you guys next time.